Well, sorry, y'all, I'm running a little bit late with all the Easter stuff, but we'll go ahead and dive in today. Happy Easter, everyone. Good to see you all. Those of you I have not seen yet, I've seen some of you in person. Some of you I saw seconds ago, Trey. So happy Easter to everyone. Today, we are running late, but the lesson is short, so it'll come out okay in the wash, I think. But first, any questions before we dive into the chronicler today? Sounds like the Riddler, the chronicler. Yeah, well,
Of course, me. Do they think that there was one, or is that just the collective name?
There are arguments. In the old days, yeah, we'll talk about this. The old days, they really thought Ezra got credit for Chronicles. You know, it's a good question. When you have these schools of thought, the pendulum swings on most things now. The idea is more people probably have their hands in than fewer. They're probably coming from schools. There's probably some later editing that might even go on. And so we absolutely don't know, but likely there's more than fewer. Same with Paul's letters. Paul, you can make a good argument, and I do buy this, that Paul stands behind all of his letters, but he did not actually take up pen in hand and write the letters. He's the chief of the organization, like a presidential speechwriter. I've used that image before. So he's the one that's standing behind it, and it's his theology, no doubt. But he may not have written all the pieces, all the words in the letter, if that makes sense. But when it comes to these historical books, the pendulum has swung to schools of thought. So the chronicler school is probably what most scholars would go with at this point, but we have absolutely no idea. You can make a good argument it's not Ezra, and we'll talk about that in a little bit here. But good question. Other initial questions here. All right. Well, let me share screen here, and we'll. Move the bracket here. Just a tad more. There we go. All right, so this week we do have a short section here of First and Second Chroniclers. We're back to another historical epic here. This is one that runs parallel to some books, some history that we've had before. It's probably compiled and written later than the Deuteronomistic history, probably written sometime in the 400s, which is why we're talking about it, why the book slots it here, because it was probably written post Ezra, time of Ezra, Nehemiah, right after that. It covers this. One of the things that's complicated about it, covers a lot of the same ground as the Deuteronomistic history, but it focuses more narrowly on the reign of David and the reign of Solomon and the reigns of the kings in Judea. It doesn't deal so much with Israel, doesn't really care about Israel very much. So it's a narrower focus. It's covering a lot of the same territory from 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, but it's a narrower focus, mainly in the southern end of the kingdom, and a lot on David and Solomon, and less on the folks in the north. That just is not on the chronicler's radar screen. It seems like the chronicler does have a copy of the Deuteronomistic history that he's drawing from, or they have a copy that they're drawing from, if it's a school of thought. So a lot of things are picked up and brought over with some modifications. And so the modifications become kind of interesting. Well, why'd they change this? Why is this different? Was it, what was their rationale for doing this? And it looks like we can piece together some motives because of that. And it looks like there's a very different purpose the chronicler has as opposed to the Deuteronomistic historian. Now, if you remember, we talked about the other schools of thought out there. We talked about the school of the priests, the priestly school, and they were the ones that had their fingerprints all over the Torah. They're the ones that finally compiled the Torah into the form that we have it. Probably during the time of the exile is when that final form of the Torah, as it comes down to us, was developed. And that school of thought was really interested in the first creation story was theirs, and they're really interested in the law. They're interested in things that are ceremonial in the law, circumcision, dietary law, Sabbath keeping, all of those kinds of things. How can we be good Jews? We've got to do these things the law commands us to do. About the same time, the Deuteronomistic history is also compiled in more or less its final form. And if you remember them, we were in them for a long time, from Joshua all the way down through Second Kings and all the way through a lot of the prophets. They seem to have their fingerprints on compiling all of those things. And if you remember what their emphasis was, and we talked about this quite a bit, their emphasis was, you better get straight with God. You're messing up. You're not following God. You need to follow God unconditionally and faithfully. Otherwise, things are not going to go well for us. And sure enough, the exile happens, and that's kind of a confirmation of things not going well. So the P school, the priestly school, is all about remaining faithful to God through practices that allow you to follow God, no matter where you are. If you have a temple, great. Even if you don't have a temple, you can still do these things: circumcise your kids, keep kosher dietary law, all that. And the Deuteronomistic history also stresses following God, but with the carrot and stick approach. We want you to follow God and be rewarded, but we don't want you to not follow God and get punished. So that is heavily the emphases of these two other schools of thought. And you can sum it up and say that in a real way, the DH, the Deuteronomistic history, is about why we got into this mess of the exile. And P is about how we can get out of the exile. We can move forward with faithful practices. So DH says you better be faithful to God, and the priestly school says this is how you can be faithful to God. And this is how we have not been faithful in the past. We've not been following these practices. Let's get back to the basics, y'all. All right, so with that as the backdrop, and remember this is in the 500s, probably the early 500s, that these two schools of thought are probably being compiled during the exile in Babylon in their final forms. So the chronicler is coming about a century and a half later. And I know in our minds, we compress all these things. Well, they're in the Bible, a century and a half, no big deal. I mean, century and a half, we're talking Reconstruction era in the United States, right after the Civil War. That is a long while. A lot of things can happen in 150-ish years. Our country today is very different from the country in the 1870s. I mean, good heavens, you had Custer and the Battle of Little Bighorn during the 1870s, 145 years ago. So it's tempting to just say, oh, it's all old. It all just kind of compresses together. But there's a significant gap here between the priestly school, the Deuteronomistic history school, and now this chronicler school or group of thoughts, group of thinking, school of thought. All right, so far so good? All right, so that's our run-up. So what is the chronicler about? So the chronicler now is facing different issues. The exile is now a century and a half in the past, just like the Civil War is way in the past for us. There's still repercussions of the Civil War in American society. There's still repercussions of the exile for the chronicler, but they're facing a different set of issues now. We're back home, some of us. We've got a temple again, not as great as it was, but it is a temple. It's not destroyed anymore. We've got Jerusalem rebuilt and the walls rebuilt. Okay, it's not as big as it was. It's not as important as it was. It's not as beautiful as it was. There aren't as many people as there used to be. And yes, we are subservient to the Persian Empire. We're not independent anymore. So this is a very different context. The chronicler is trying to revisit these stories of David and Solomon and the other kings with this in mind. Not get your act together or else things are going to go bad. The bad has happened. Now, what do we do? How do we move forward in this returned context that God has placed us in? And I want to put in a couple extended quotes from the book here. I think he sums things up very well here. So the 5th century BC was the 400s were a dreary period in Israel's history. The great empire of David and Solomon had long since crumbled. The Assyrians had destroyed northern Israel. The Babylonians left little of Jerusalem. During the 5th century, the powerful Persian Empire reached its zenith. All that remained, all that remained of the nation Israel, of national Israel, was a tiny province of Judah, a small portion of Persia's vast domain. Solomon's magnificent temple had been replaced by one of much less splendor. The once great Davidic monarch had been reduced to a provincial governorship subject to Persian authority. And to continue that quote, to make matters worse. Oh, this is not from our book. This is from a different book. Sorry. To make matters worse, the initial freedom of the release from exile in 539 BC had raised the hopes and expectations of the Jewish people. It was a time of high anticipation. Soon, many thought the Messiah would come and usher Judah into a new age of greatness, but those hopes were quickly disappointed. Those who returned to Jerusalem found the city in shambles. The population was small and lacking in material wealth. It was soon apparent that the Messianic age had not arrived. So that's the historical context here of where the chronicler is trying to do some work and trying to address these issues and trying to rework the earlier history of the Deuteronomistic historians into something that speaks to his/their time period. So what the chronicler is really about is trying to instill some hope by reconnecting us in the 400s to the glory days of David and Solomon. And so the chronicler has a different agenda, very much so than the Deuteronomistic historian. And the other thing he's trying to connect with is not just David and Solomon, but the whole story. The wonderful relationship God has had with all of the patriarchs and before, from Adam down to Abraham, down to Moses too. So the focus is not on these people, but he does pay, he or they pay some lip service, some attention to them in the early part of First Chronicles. And remember, First and Second is a later addition. It was one book of Chronicles, like it was one book of Kings and one book of Samuel originally. All right. So, in a real way, and this is, I think, the crux of all of this, the chronicler is trying to remind the people that they're part of a big story. The P and DH have laid out, the priestly school, the Deuteronomistic school have laid out a century and more beforehand. We're trying to make sure you still know things are bad, but you're still part of this people. You're still part of the story. Even though things aren't as spiffy as they were in the glory days, you are a part of it. Then the other piece that's important for understanding the chronicler is not warning people about negative behavior. That's the continuing refrain of the Deuteronomistic school is behave, stop worshiping foreign gods, you're going to get punished, God's going to abandon you, stop. Well, the exiles happened. And now the people are serious about following God. Idolatry is not really much of a problem in Israel anymore. So all of that emphasis is no longer really important. And so what the chronicler does is kind of just omit all those warnings about idolatry, all those warnings about pagan practices. That's kind of excised from First and Second Kings and First and Second Samuel. And when you remove that, you can condense those two books into a shorter work very easily. And that's why Chronicles is significantly shorter, one of the main pieces there. So in the old days, I used to think, well, the chronicler is just airbrushing things out. Maybe he's got a weak constitution, or maybe he just doesn't like to admit that his heroes have flaws. So he's trying to just smooth over all the warts. But that's probably not what's happening here. The books of the Deuteronomistic history are still available. If you want to look them up, you can look them up. But we want to represent the story in a different way with a more hopeful view here. And so rather, instead of just airbrushing out the bad stuff, really what the chronicler seems to be doing is more of an attempt to focus on the glorious heritage we used to have and the promise of what might yet come again. So in some ways, the chronicler is like those people writing about King Arthur, the once and future king. We had this glorious time in the past. It has collapsed into a dark age. It's tough now, but there's hope for a rebirth, a renaissance, more glory to come. So that's the overall ethos of the chronicler as we will go through First and Second Chronicles. So we won't have to do a lot of stuff about David and Solomon because we've done a lot of it, but there are some differences, and we'll talk about some of those. So let's pause for just a second. I'm going to have a swig of protein here. Thoughts or comments from you all so far? Hearing no one chime up or chirp up, chime in, chirp up. We'll press on then. All right. So First and Second Chronicles do draw heavily on especially Second Samuel. First Samuel not so much. They're not that interested in Saul. But Second Samuel and First and Second Kings are very heavily drawn upon here, and the chronicler also does pull in some of Torah. So we're not ignoring these other two great schools of thought. The Old Testament is not quite locked in yet, but these writings in the Old Testament are pretty well in their finalized forms at this point, at least the writings so far, the DH school, the P school. Plus, there is some bringing in of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, plus some Psalms. And so it seems like the fact that the chronicler is drawing on all of these things are also indication. The scholars love that because that indicates to them that before the 400s, these things are getting kind of finalized into their final written form, more or less. And so, yes, Bob.
Sorry, I interrupted your sentence.
No.
So what we would call the Pentateuch and most of the Haftarahs were not fully baked in yet at this time. What was being used in worship? Does anybody know?
Well, it's not baked in at the exile. It gets baked in during the exile, but now it is baked in during the chronicler's time, if that makes sense. There's a lot of discussion about that, Bob. How much, and we have no hard, solid proof, and so you get all kinds of scholarly opinions from, it was written down in a quasi-finalized format, maybe a few changes very early, to it really wasn't locked in until the exile. But the exile period is kind of the watershed at that point. It seems that the Jewish rabbinic school in Babylon is really trying to get the Torah locked in. So by the chronicler's time, it seems to be pretty well baked in. Now, what did they use before then? That's a great question. How observant were they beforehand? We've seen some evidence. We saw evidence in Ezra and Nehemiah that, oh my, we should do the Feast of Booths like it talked about in Deuteronomy. We haven't been doing that, so we should do that. We saw back earlier in Josiah's time when they read the law. Oh, crud, we haven't been observing these things. We should do that. And so, what we see as normative practices of modern Judaism probably started pretty strongly in the 500s BC, but may not have been that strong beforehand. Maybe they were done intermittently. Maybe they were done sporadically. Maybe they did them during Moses' time and then stopped them. We're trying to guess based on these other historical clues, but it seems like it's not baked in at that point. So some kind of, there are probably proto versions of the Torah out there, no doubt. There's argument about whether Deuteronomy was floating around or whether that got written in the 600s. There are those kind of discussions, but probably some of these things were passed around orally. Probably some of them were starting to be written down in chunks at least. And remember, with especially with Genesis and less with Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, there are a lot of layers in there. So these layers are probably all floating around for centuries before it gets locked in the 500s. But whether they're compiled in one place or whether they're floating around in lots of places, that's a big scholarly question mark. So it's a good question, Bob, and there's no definitive easy answer. And like Harry Truman said about economists, you line up 50 economists end to end and they point in all directions. You line up 50 biblical scholars on the Pentateuch and you'll get some variety of scholarly opinion on that. But by the chronicler's time, at least those parts seem to be locking in pretty strongly, pretty firmly. Daniel, Ezekiel, some of those are still up. Well, Ezekiel not so much, but Daniel is not even probably written yet at this point. Some other we'll come to some of those questions in the next couple of weeks, but this earlier stuff probably is getting locked in. All right, the other thing the chronicler draws on, and this is what drives scholars crazy with envy, the chronicler mentions stuff. He mentions a source of Samuel, not First and Second Samuel, but a different source of Samuel, a book of Nathan, a book of Gad, and other things. We have absolutely no idea or record of what these books are. Maybe one day somebody will find a cache in the desert and dig up a copy of the book of Nathan, but it is lost to us right now. Same thing, you may remember in the late 90s or early O's, we had known about a Gospel of Judas. There was reference to a Gospel of Judas for centuries. Then they finally dug up a copy. And it's a Gnostic gospel. It's a later gospel. It's a bizarre gospel, but they knew of it by title, but had no copy of it until our lifetime, until Jimmy's lifetime, like Lisa's lifetime. It was rediscovered. So maybe one of these others will surface one of these days, but as of yet, we're just shooting in the dark. So the chronicler is referencing things that we also don't have. So we have stuff that he is referencing, they are referencing, that we do have, and there's some stuff that we don't have as well. So that's tantalizing to scholars and frustrating that we can't reconstruct that. All right, as I said early before we started, the prophet Ezra, the priest Ezra, used to be thought of as the writer of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and also First and Second Chronicles. There's been some real pushback on that, really, since I've been in seminary. So in the past 25 years or so, some scholars in this area really started pushing back on that. So you still might see that out there. There's still some scholars that would probably adhere to that. But one of the things that's pointed out is the chronicler is just a little bit different in viewpoint than Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah, that heavy focus on putting away foreign wives, well, the chronicler doesn't even touch on that. So if that really is from Ezra, we would expect some hint, some reference of that. Also, in Ezra and Nehemiah, you don't get you get the hope that the northern kingdom will be restored one day. Well, you don't get that the same way. Let me flip that. Ezra and Nehemiah, you don't get the stuff about that, but the chronicler does want all the Jewish people to be restored eventually, the entire territory to come back to David. They want to restore everything, not just Jerusalem, but the entire point. So scholars are pushing back on that, and that's still a live debate in Old Testament circles at this point. All right, so in the book of Chronicles, or in the books of Chronicles, used to be one book, now two. Really, if you look and remember, First and Second Samuel. First Samuel is about David and Saul. Second Samuel is David jumping into the throne, and then First Kings is about Solomon ascending to the throne, and then the aftermath of Solomon and the rest of First Kings and Second Kings. So we're treading over some of this land, but there's a heavy focus on David in Chronicles, and then a heavy focus on Solomon, and then a much quicker rip through these other kings in the southern kingdom, and really not much at all about kings in the north. So I'm going to just talk about these four sections real quick here. The genealogies. And we come to genealogies, I've said this before, our eyes roll up in the back of our heads. Oh gosh, genealogies in the Bible. Cultures back then were very much into genealogies, and they still see them as prized. More traditionalist cultures today in Africa, they love pouring through biblical genealogies. African Christians really enjoy these genealogies because they also treasure genealogies in their tribal memories. And even if you're living in a city, your grandmother may have grown up on the farm or grown up in a tribal village. And so genealogies are much more important in oral cultures than they are in cultures like ours. And so there's a lot of focus on genealogies here. And the line is traced from Adam all the way to David. So this is not just connecting us with King David, but connecting us all the way back with all of Torah. And so the chronicler through these genealogies is trying to bring those in. So seems rather unimportant to us, highly important to its original audience. This ties us in as a people, not just to David, but to the entire salvation history from Genesis all the way down, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all the way down through David and down to today. We are part of this continuum. We are part of this family, this tribe, this grouping, this clan. We are part of this people. And so we need to remember that and celebrate that. And maybe God will restore us one day to the grandeur we once had. What it also does is it gives continuity to these post-exilic Jews and hooks them back in. Remember, Abraham promised this whole land to you. Well, David ruled that whole land. Solomon kind of let it slip through his fingers, but maybe one day we'll get it back. And so there's a real message of hope here with the chronicler. Having said that, the chronicler spends more time on Jacob's line, especially on Judah and Benjamin. The kingdoms of Judah are stressed more than they are in the other, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin are stressed more than they are in the rest of Torah. The rest of Torah gives more lip service to all the tribes, all 13 of them, if you split Joseph up into Ephraim and Manasseh. But here we put more focus on the tribe that's settled around Jerusalem, the tribe of Judah plus the remnant of Benjamin that's settled around Jerusalem, and the tribe of Levi to a lesser extent because they're the ones dealing with the temple. So all these things are highlighted by the chronicler. And so, what is important to the chronicler seems to be monarchy, something lost, something maybe we can get back. Priesthood, something we still have during the chronicler's time. And also, by emphasizing the Levites, you're not just emphasizing the priests, but you're emphasizing those other descendants of Levi, the Levites, who assist in the temple, who may not be priests, but they are of the larger tribe of Levi and assist the priests in the temple. Right. So that's the first section, these genealogies. Our eyes roll up in the back of our heads, but the chronicler is trying to remind us of all these things, most likely. The chroniclers are trying to remind us of all these things. The importance of David, the importance of all the patriarchs, Adam, Abraham, Moses, plus Jacob's sons, especially Judah, Benjamin, Levi. And the chronicler does switch to a pretty long section about King David. And again, it's about King David as King David, not King David as the Robin Hood character who was the warlord who was on the run from Saul. That's really not what the chronicler is interested in. He's more interested in David once he becomes king. And once he becomes king, here's that question of airbrushing things again, whether it's airbrushed or whether he's emphasizing things. All the stuff about David and Bathsheba is omitted. All the problems with David's children, the civil war that son Absalom raises against his father, that is omitted as well. And so what that leaves you with when you don't have those things, I love 2 Samuel, I love 1 Samuel because it shows us David, warts and all. He's a very human character that I can really resonate with as a human being. But the chronicler has a different motive here. He wants us to see this idealized picture of the monarchy, the once and future, perhaps, monarchy. And so hopefully we'll have this again, have another wonderful king like King David was. The other thing the chronicler does, if you ever see that movie with Richard Gere, I don't know if you remember the David movie with Richard Gere. At the end of the movie, David is poring over these plans and these models of the temple. Well, David doesn't build the temple. 1st and 2nd Samuel don't mention anything about this. Where the heck are the Hollywood screenwriters getting it from? Are they making it up? No, they're getting this from Chronicles. Chronicles spends a lot of time talking about David laying groundwork. No, he will not be the builder of the temple, but he is in many ways, in the chronicler's viewpoint, the one that stands behind the temple, even, almost the architect of the temple. And when he dies, his son Solomon pulls the trigger and makes David's temple a reality. But whereas the Deuteronomistic history very much sees this happening under Solomon's reign only, David wanted to build the temple. God said no. David lets it go. In the chronicler's view, David is interested in the temple to the point of making some extensive preparatory plans during his reign. So that's a huge difference with King David and Chronicles. So all that stuff, Richard Gere's screenwriters didn't make it up. They are pulling from Chronicles on that. The other thing that we get from the chronicler is we get these stories of David's mighty men or mighty warriors, depending on your Bible translation. These only appear in Chronicles. These don't appear in any other source that we have. They may appear in some of those lost books that we don't have, but they're not in 2 Samuel or 1 Samuel. And so we do get these wonderful stories of these heroic leaders in David's organization and army. So just for example, Chronicles 11, there's this wonderful story here. 3 of the 30 chiefs went down to the rock to David at the cave of Adullam, while the army of Philistines was encamped in the valley of Rephaim. David was then in the stronghold, and the garrison of the Philistines was then at Bethlehem. So David is remembering, the Philistines are camped in David's hometown. And David out loud says longingly, "Oh, that someone would give me water to drink from the well of Bethlehem that's by the gate. I'm remembering that wonderful well I drank at as a kid. Now the Philistines are tramping all over my hometown." And so he just kind of expresses this thought out loud. Kind of like King Henry II with Thomas Becket saying to his knights, "Oh, won't somebody rid me of this priest?" Well, some of the knights go out and kill the bishop, Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket. David, "Oh, I wish I could have some water from Bethlehem." So 3 of these guys decide they're going to break their way through the Philistine lines. They do. They battle their way into Bethlehem. They get water from the well, and they bring it back to David. Well, David just kind of said this as a throwaway line, and then 3 of his guys have risked their lives to bring him a drink from Bethlehem. And so David is just kind of shocked by this behavior, and he's overwhelmed by it, and he refuses to drink it. In his mind, apparently, it's like drinking the blood of his men. His men have risked their blood to get this water for him. This is too holy a thing for him to drink himself. So he's going to offer it up to the Lord as a sacrifice. And so he pours it out on the ground to the Lord. He says, "May God forbid I should do this. Can I drink the blood of these men? For at the risk of their lives, they brought it." Therefore, he would not drink. And these 3 mighty men, warriors, did this wonderful thing. So it's kind of a cool story. It says something interesting about David. It says something about the loyalty of his men, that on an offhand comment, 3 of the guys would strap on swords and risk their lives just to get a drink from the well he used to drink at as a kid. So Chronicles has this, and we don't have that anywhere else in Scripture or any other source. So kind of cool. All right. Chronicles also has a focus on King Solomon. Notice there's only 9 chapters on Solomon. There were 11 earlier, and there were 19 chapters on King David here. So less focus on Solomon than on David here, but we still get a picture of Solomon. It's a little bit different than the DH. Solomon is not so despotic. It doesn't mention so much his excesses, all of his wives, all of his conspicuous consumption, all the food he goes through, all the gold vessels he eats and drinks from. Also, it doesn't really talk about Solomon building his palace. It focuses on Solomon building the temple, and putting the focus on that piece of Solomon's reign. The temple is what's important to Solomon, not palaces, not kingship, not being an Oriental monarch that has a huge harem and a huge banquet hall every night filled with lots of food. No, we don't get that. Instead, it is a focus really strictly on pretty much on the temple. And we don't get that fall like we had in chapter 11 of 1 Kings, where Solomon just plummets at the end and becomes completely faithless to the God of Israel. So is it airbrushing, or is it a way of trying to see this is the glory days? This is what we're hoping to get back to. Wonderful monarchs like David and Solomon. chronicler seems to be going very much in that latter direction. And after that chunk on Solomon, there are accounts of the kings of Judah. And the chronicler, as we said, basically ignores the northern kingdom, basically ignores the civil war, and also basically ignores all the bad kings of Judah, as well as all the bad kings of Israel. Remember, all the kings are bad in Israel. Most of the kings are bad in Judah, the southern kingdom, with a couple of exceptions. Well, the chronicler really focuses in on these exceptions and doesn't focus in so much on the bad kings. Again, it may be a little idealized of a view of a monarchy. Maybe we can get a monarchy back, and maybe it'll be a wonderful thing. He does also expand talking about Hezekiah. Hezekiah's reforms are only one verse in 2 Kings. There are 3 chapters in Chronicles. And so Hezekiah is regarded as a good king who reforms things, but we're going to spend some time and talk about how he's reforming things. And as we mentioned back when we were going through 2 Kings, Chronicles also adds an addendum to the story of the bad king Manasseh. Talks about him being imprisoned, being dragged off to Syria, and then coming to his senses and repenting and following God again. And so we have a repentant Manasseh in Chronicles. Remember, we talked about that canticle of Manasseh that we use at morning prayer during Lent that comes later. This is part of the chronicler's view here, that Manasseh was a bad king who repented and became a good thing. And Chronicles ends with the Babylonian exile and then the Persian restoration. In fact, the Persian restoration is mentioned in Chronicles in the same way it's mentioned in Ezra, which kind of originally led some folks think Ezra had a hand in both of those things. That's one of the arguments for it, that the end of Chronicles and the beginning of Ezra treading over exactly the same ground in the same words. So we got the Persian restoration under Cyrus. So in a way, the chronicler is claiming the whole history of Israel, not just through the Babylonian exile, but out the other side of the Babylonian exile to restoration under Cyrus and the Persian Empire. So if you think about it, the Deuteronomistic history is about how we got into this mess. P is about how we can get out of it through these faithful practices. We talked about that a moment ago. What the chronicler is interested in is how God's character functions faithfully. He has been faithful through the whole sweep of history to his people, and he'll be faithful still. And even though things aren't wonderful right now, even though our temple is small, even though our capital city, Jerusalem, is a shadow of its former self, God is faithful. So if we trust this God, if we are obedient to this God, maybe one day we will get to experience this wonderful, glorious restoration of the way things used to be. Okay, questions about Chronicles? I want to talk about one more thing here before we wrap.
Dan, you may have mentioned this. I know the Book of Kings had another book that was extant at the time that they referenced. Was that still around by the time
That's a good
Chronicles
question.
that they were drawing?
Are those annals of the kings of, the Book of Kings always talks about these different annals and things. I'm not sure if that's an interesting question to cross-reference those lists and see if those are the same books that are extant or different. I don't know. It's a great question. Great question. The prophet Nathan is mentioned in the Bathsheba story. He's a big player in that, but so there's no book of Nathan mentioned in 2 Samuel, but it is mentioned with Chronicles. So
Sure.
At least that's there are some things that are different, but maybe some of the same. Good question. Abby.
Yes, when it comes to Israel being recreated in 1948, do many of those people feel like perhaps their faithfulness has resulted in the creation of Israel?
The Zionist movement is very complex. Yes, there certainly were folks that saw that as God's blessing on them. There were also some Zionists who were basically agnostic. They were secular Jews, and they were more interested in physical protection because of monstrous stuff like the Holocaust. We need our own homeland as a people because of geopolitical forces. So you have the full spectrum, but there are no doubt plenty of folks in the early days of Israel that really did see this as God's blessing on us. And the fact that we were able to, all these Arab nations surrounding Israel attacked us immediately when we started declaring our independence, and yet we've survived. And so there's a strong strain in today's Israel of that kind of thinking, though it's not universal. Israel today has to deal with the problem of secularism, and the people that hate the secularist Jews most are the ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel. They think that they are horrible examples of Judaism, and and as happens in our country, oftentimes secular folks will clash, especially with fundamentalists, before they'll clash with more moderate mainline type folks. And so, those two groups are often at odds in Israeli politics. It's a real combative thing at times.
Okay.
Well, Chronicles is the last of the historical books that kind of narrates history. And so I just want to step back for a second and talk about meta-narratives. Meta-narrative, if you're not familiar with the term, is just a scholarly term used in literary scholarship, historical scholarship. What are the big stories? We've got a bunch of individual stories here, but what's the big overarching story as well, or stories? What things are important? And so I just wanted to talk about some of the meta-narratives in the Old Testament, because we've looked at a lot of historical stuff happening here. And this list is not exhaustive at all. So just a few meta-narratives that jump out of the Old Testament is one from the very beginning, from the priestly creation story. God creates creation to be good. God wants relationship with his people. God's not creating slaves. God's not creating automatons. God is creating individuals with choice, and he loves them, and it's good and wonderful. And things happen. They turn away. It's like rust. God's good creation gets rusty, but that's not the iron's fault. It's the fault of the oxygen in the water causing corrosion to God's otherwise good creation. So, whereas a lot of worldviews in the Middle East and the Greco-Roman world later would have a view of dualism, where anything tangible and material is bad, only the spiritual is good. One of the meta themes all through scripture here is that creation is good, yet corroded, fallen, whatever you want to, it's not that God created something awful. It's God created something good, and we've let it get bad. We've let it get corroded, and maybe God needs to get the steel wool out and get the rust off. And like your cast iron pan, there's a rust spot, you got to get that off and re-oil it and retreat it there. So that's one of the meta narratives. Another meta narrative is God often shows his strength by choosing the unlikeliest people. Over and over and over and over again, from Genesis through Exodus, even choosing these people of Israel. They're not Assyria, they're not Persia, they're not Greece, they're not Rome, they're not a big, powerful conqueror, they're not the Egyptians, they're not these big geopolitical powers. It's a people that have this little territory. They keep getting trodden down, and yet God has chosen them as the special vessel to show his power. And what's more, in individual families, God often will choose the youngest person in the family. Whether you're talking about Abraham and the son of Isaac, the younger son is preferred. Whether you're talking about Jacob and Joseph is preferred. Whether you're talking about Jesse's family, and Jesse has all these older sons, but the young King David, the youngest, is the one who's preferred. So over and over again, God shows his power by choosing something unlikely, something weak to operate in. God shows his strength by operating in the midst of our weakness. And another meta narrative, and one that the Zionists really did seize on again in the 1900s, is this idea of territory, that we have been given this land as a gift and a heritage from God. That we have all the way through Scripture. You know, Abraham's given the promise, even though he goes to Egypt almost immediately. He comes back, even though he doesn't own anything at his death except one cave. It's a family plot. Still, the promise is there for Abraham's descendants. And even though his descendants are carried off into exile in Egypt and get enslaved later in Egypt, they're there for centuries, 400 years, yet God brings them back to the land. And even though the exile happens and most of the Jews get hauled off, yet there is that restoration, at least partial, of bringing Jewish people back into the land. And so that's a huge meta narrative all through the Old Testament. And there are undoubtedly, we could probably come up with many other meta narratives as well, but these are three big ones that do operate through all of these different historical books of the Old Testament, and as well as the prophets. And you know, these themes come up over and over again. So any thoughts or questions about meta narratives or the larger subject or larger view here? All right. Well, the focus next week is going to be a turning away from history. We've only got a few weeks left. And let me ask something. I'm not sure. I need to look a little further ahead here. But I'm not sure our Old Testament book gets us all the way up to the New Testament as much as I might like to do that. So I'm wondering if we might add an extra session at the end. We were going to finish on May 2nd with this, but I'm toying with maybe getting us over the New Testament goal line on May 9th. I need to check out the book a little more thoroughly, and I'll get back to you. I'll do that this week, but maybe that might be good. So if you have any thoughts on that, let me know. But next week we've got some non-historical books. That's a thumbs up from Bob there. Non-historical books, Psalms and Proverbs, which are Psalms especially is one of the backbones of Christian worship and hugely important to us. I could spend weeks alone on Psalms. We're going to do it in part of a time next time, along with Proverbs and some other stuff about wisdom literature. So thoughts or comments or questions here at this point? Like I said, this will be a shorter day today, and it is. So. All right.
No comment and good job.
Well, thank you. Thank you. One thing we might also be thinking about is what we want to do in the fall. I mentioned last week I was toying with in the late spring during Lent. Easter's late next year. During Lent, at least, to look at the book of Revelation and maybe into early Easter as well. I think Easter's like the 17th of April next year. So it's in the last possible week that it can be. So it's a later Easter, but we do get readings from Revelation during Easter season next year. And so I thought we might do that, but that really is not something we could do all year. I don't want to spend that much time on it. So be thinking about that. I don't know if we want to do something with the New Testament overview or what, or if there's something else people have in mind, but be thinking about that. And let's talk about that next time. So those are the homework assignments. Whether we have an extra session on May 9th and whether what we do in the fall. And hopefully by the fall, we might be able to gather very easily in person again. I'm hoping that's the case. So we'll see what happens. All right, y'all. Well, happy Easter, and we'll stop it there. And we'll see you next time.